Hello and welcome to That Canon Guy's Reviews. It has been about 4 years since my last video, which is pretty ridiculous. But I decided to actually start and make some more camera content since I have a lot of different cameras coming through the office right now and a lot of interesting old digitals. In this video, I'm just going to be doing a quick review slash overview of the Canon EOS Digital Rebel, otherwise known as the 300D in Europe and some other countries. I'll be doing a full overview on this camera, basically my thoughts on it, a little bit of history, and also kind of like a function overview, which I used to do in a lot of my older videos. But first I'm going to start off with what most people are probably here for, whether or not you should buy this camera. Also, I'd like to apologize for the filming quality. It will get better in upcoming videos. I'm actually just filming on some random camcorder. I was able to find all my other cameras out of battery for right now, so pretty scattered video. I felt like I wanted to film tonight. So without further ado, let's get in to this camera overview. So you're probably asking yourself, who is this camera for? And I guess I can explain that a little bit right now. Basically, this camera is for anybody who wants to take good photos and wants the experience of using older technology, or also could be somebody on a budget. I guess those would be about the three reasons that you buy this camera. Or if you're just a camera enthusiast like me and want to work with old technology, which in this case, this camera was released in 2003, which I'll talk about that in a bit, but it definitely falls under that category. I do want to start with a quick point that you can get good photos with pretty much any camera. So this camera here would be no exception to that rule. You can get good photos with this camera, with your phone, with any sort of camera. Good photos are all down to the photographer and the composition and things like that. It's never really down to the hardware and the equipment you have. Not saying that hardware and equipment can't be helpful to try and capture what you want to see, but the camera does not always matter and is definitely not the most important thing in getting good photos. Next, I guess we should go through some of the pros and cons of this camera over other cameras that you might be looking at getting. First up, let me fire up my photo tent here and set this on a tripod so we can get a little bit better view instead of this grainy look. We can see more like that. Okay, so let's take a quick overview of the pros of this camera. As you can see, this is a very rugged looking camera compared to a lot of the point and shoots and other things you may be used to. If you're used to other digital SLR cameras, this is also very durable as opposed to those. It does have a plastic body, but being the first digital Rebel, this was built better than most. I'd say better than the XT, the T1 series, all that kind of thing. It's not weather sealed, so that's the one downside to it, but it's a very, very solid plastic construction. It has a very nice beefy grip on it. It's actually better than the grip on my 5D Classic and definitely better, far superior to anything in the later Rebel line. The first big pro I see to using this camera is going to be the photographic experience you will get with it. This is definitely not quite as technologically advanced as newer cameras, and that can actually work to its advantages. You have full manual modes and a lot of different features and settings that you can work on setting yourself to get the photos that you want. This is going to be a really great learning aid for anybody sort of getting into photography, and anybody who's really experienced can use the features built into this camera to take great shots. It's not exactly like film photography, but I would relate it more to that kind of experience in shooting this camera, just because the technology is obviously older, a little bit slower moving, and you won't get any sort of crazy high-speed options or crazy autofocus. That could be chalked up as a con as well. And if you're just the kind of person who's trying to take good photos and you have the right type of subject that can take advantage of this camera, just kind of single shot and all that, you don't have any action going on, this is going to be a great camera to do that. And I'll really teach you a lot of different aspects of photography at the same time. Another big con for this camera is going to be price. Depending on where you look to buy this camera, this is going to be a very affordable one, coming in anywhere between $50 and $100. Usually with a lens, if you look on eBay and similar places, you might also have a family member or have a pawn shop locally that would have one of these cameras for sale, and they would likely have a very inexpensive price on it. And another big pro is image quality. Despite the age on this camera, it is going to still have very, very good image quality. You'll be really surprised at how well it compares to modern cameras. The technology has not changed that much. You have an APS-C size sensor in this camera, meaning that you can get really nice blurred out backgrounds while also having really nice images. And I guess one last pro on this camera is going to be the second display at the top there. I'll touch on that later. But a lot of the newer digital SLR cameras in the Rebel series will not have the display, and that can be very helpful to confirm settings and see how everything's working. Okay, so I guess we went through a bunch of the pros. Let's go quickly through some of the cons here. One of the big cons, and obviously is going to turn most people away from this camera who are not here for the photography aspect, is that this does not shoot video. This is a photography only camera. Okay, so the next con is going to be the consumer orientation of this camera. Despite the amount of functions, this definitely is lacking some compared to the more professional cameras, including the Leica custom functions, which I'll show you later on, and also the Pentameter finder, which is a little bit dimmer than the higher end cameras. Like I said, this does share body styling and really good ergonomics with some of the higher end cameras, so you actually won't have that as much of a con here compared to the later Rebel series, but it still does have a plastic body as previously mentioned, and also, as I'll mention later, is lacking the rubber grip of higher end models. Another downside, if you could call it that, is going to be the battery compatibility and also the memory cards this camera uses. I'll mention this later as well when I go through a functionality overview, but this camera uses CF memory cards, which is an older technology. I actually prefer them over SD just for the reliability and all that, but that's probably just me. A lot of people these days use a lot of SD cards, micro SD cards, that type of thing, and CF cards is a little bit older technology. So you will have to be aware of that. Also, the battery is going to be a little bit older style, so if you have some of the newer Canon cameras, your newer batteries will not fit into this camera. This one uses BP511 batteries. If you have a lot older cameras, it actually is probably a pro, because a lot of the older cameras use this BP511 battery. Okay, and the last thing here that I wrote down as a con, just some kind of the major ones, is that this is not a techie camera, meaning that it's not going to have a lot of the technological advances and things that came in throughout the years in the newer cameras. This camera came out in 2003 and is really just a photography machine. It doesn't have a lot of focusing points, fast frames per second, and a lot of the features you're going to get in the later cameras. Even things like live view, the larger LCD, and things we just take for granted these days if you've used any of those newer cameras. That being said, that's not what this camera is, and if you're looking for those features, I would look elsewhere. And one thing I was going to bring up under the con section is going to be the grip material on these cameras. If you find a 300D, it's likely going to have some deteriorated grip material still on there. It's originally had kind of a rubberized coating on the grip when it came out, and over time that deteriorated and wore away in most cases. As you can see, this one's been all cleaned up with isopropyl rubbing alcohol and basically removed all that nasty rubber stuff. So now it's just a plastic grip. Like I said, very ergonomic and fits nicely, but it's not going to have the high quality rubber grips that you'll find on the higher end cameras like the 20D, 30D, 40D, etc. It also has this material on this plate right here with your ports, and as you can see, I've removed the sticky residue and actually just kind of brushed the shiny plastic underneath to give it a pretty nice look. So that's definitely not a huge con, but is something to watch out for when you buy these cameras. It may have some deteriorated, sticky, kind of rubberized material on those spots there. Okay, and now let's get into the next side of this review. We're going to start with the history of this camera. This camera was released in September of 2003 and was the first in Canon's EOS digital Rebel line. They had some film Rebels before, but this was the first digital one, and it came in at an introductory price of $899 according to DP Review. And it was also announced as the first digital SLR camera under $1,000. So that was quite a milestone. It shared a sensor with the Canon EOS 10D of the time, and also had one more cornerstone feature. As you can see on this camera right here, we have the kit lens EFS 18 to 55mm. And this also marked the introduction of a new variation of Canon's lens mount, the EFS mount, which is for APS-C type cameras. As you can see on the mount, there's a red dot and also the white dot there. This was the first camera that used that white dot and introduced the EFS lens system, which is very popular today and obviously is for Canon's APS-C series cameras. Canon's internal model number for this camera also is on the bottom there. It's upside down, but as you can see is the Canon DS6041. Also has an interesting distinction of being the only camera with Canon Digital Rebel on it and not having a suffix after that, as the XT and concurrent models had. Okay, so that's a pretty brief history. Let's go through the tech specs of this camera. Not going to spend too long on this, but like I mentioned before, this has an APS-C 6 megapixel image sensor, also borrowed from the 10D, which came out about a year prior. The ISO performance, according to DSO Mark, is 544 ISO. It's the lowest they have rated, but it's not super bad compared to some of the CCD sensors that came out at the time. And actually, it's not as bad as you'd think compared to modern cameras due to that low pixel count and thereby the low pixel density on this sensor. Compared to something even like the Canon T1i, which came out 6 years after this camera, it has actually pretty comparable ISO performance to that, so it's not something I'd be super worried about. This camera boasts only about one stop worse dynamic range than a lot of the best APS-C sensors on the market today, so nothing really that bad. Obviously, as mentioned before, this camera has no video shooting function and no possibility of getting a video image off the sensor, meaning no live view also. Also, this camera has only 7 focusing points, and I haven't actually looked that up, but I assume only 1 cross type out of that. So it's going to have good focusing performance in the center of the frame, but nothing super spectacular, especially compared to modern cameras. The memory card and batteries I already discussed there. I'll show you those here in a minute, but it uses CF memory cards, and I also think it has a storage limitation on there. You can probably only go up to about 8 gigabytes or 4 gigabytes, something like that, which will still hold plenty of photos, but you should be aware of that. Also, there are quite a few different accessories available for this camera, including a battery grip, along with a lot of the other standard accessories you can get for an SLR camera system like this. Okay, so now this is going to be kind of difficult with my current tripod setup here, but let's take a quick look around the body of the camera. First up, on the front, let's take off the lens here for now. This is the standard kit lens, like I said before, the FS 18 to 55mm Mark I. Not going to be touching on that in this video, but I might have a video coming up on that in the future. Maybe the history of the system or something similar. So anyway, let's start at the front of the camera body. As you can see on the front, you have the Canon logo, EOS logo, and Digital Rebel logo, along with the AF assistant light. Has an IR remote control sensor right here. I forgot to mention that before. So that could be a useful accessory you could get with this. And then, of course, the lens mount, EF lens mount, mirror in there. As you can see, sort of up into the finder. Coming to the side, we have a standard neck strap eyelet. The ports, which are under this cover. Let me uncover that quickly here. You have your standard micro USB, video out, and also a remote port, which is, I think, a 3.5mm or 2.5mm type remote. Should know that off the top of my head, but I don't. Also have our flash button right here, and also our aperture preview button. Coming to the back of the camera, we have a few buttons on the side here. A menu button, info button, jump button, which is for playback, as can be seen by the blue text there. Also the playback button and the delete button. Coming to this side here, we have the exposure compensation button, the light button for this little secondary display right there. Then on the 4-way control dial here, we have the ISO button, white balance, and these two are just the standard buttons, and the set button in the middle, which serves as a selection for the menus and other things like that. Also have the CF card action light right there. Then on the top here, we have our settings preview button, our autofocus selection button, and also the plus and minus zoom in, zoom out buttons for playback. Coming to the side of the camera, we have our CF card slot, and as you can see right now, I have a SanDisk Ultra 2 2GB compact flash card in there right now. You have to be careful with the pins on these cameras to insert the card properly. You don't have to be too worried about that. Coming to the side, as you can see, not too much on this side. Okay, going to the top, not too much on this side. You have your focal plane indicator right there, hot shoe right here for flash units, and as you can see, your mode dial right here. Has the ADAP, manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, program, auto, and then a few different picture presets, which is going to be portrait, landscape, macro, sports, night portrait, and no flash. Usually like to keep that in either program or manual mode, depending on what I'm doing. Right here, you have your switch that goes on and also off. And then you have your continuous shooting or shooting mode in general selection button right here. Also have a dial to the front of the camera for selecting things in the menu and also the settings there. And then you have, of course, your shutter button, which is a 2-stage button, as most of these are. Press down halfway to focus and compose, and then press down all the way to shoot. Okay, so let's power on the camera and take a quick look at the menu systems and see what we can see there. It's going to be a little bit hard to see since it's so bright in this photo tent, but let's start with the top display. As you can see, we have our white balance settings, our battery indicator, our exposure compensation level, our picture settings, or I should say image quality settings, our drive mode, and also I believe that's like beep on or something like that for the focus confirmation possibly. I actually don't know exactly what that one is. And then also how many pictures are remaining on the card. We can set some of these settings by pressing some of these buttons on the 4-way control dial. If I press the white balance here, it'll go just to the white balance mode. And then you can adjust that with that top dial that I showed you there. There's quite a few different settings here. Okay, so let's go into the menu system and give a brief overview on that. Let me move my camera down here a little bit. We try to angle that to get out of the glare of these lights, and we can go through these here quickly. As you can see, we have our quality settings, which also includes a RAW setting. For anybody who wants to shoot RAW, that's where you're going to get the best dynamic range and best quality out of this camera in general. Otherwise, you have your standard JPEG settings there. Next up, you have red eye on and off, auto exposure bracketing, white balance bracketing, beep, custom white balance, and also parameters, which I believe you can set a few different custom ones there. Yep, as you can see, a bunch of different ones there. Going on to the playback menu, you have protect, rotate, print order, autoplay, review, and also review time. Going on to the first settings menu, you have auto power off, auto rotate, LCD brightness, date and time, file number, and also the format setting, so you can format your memory card. And next up on settings menu 2, you have language, video system, communication, also clear all camera settings, sensor clean, and the firmware version. So very basic menu system. As I was mentioning before, if you go into playback, we can look at that. Have no images right now, but if you did have an image, for example, if I just snapped a photo there, you can page through the different settings here with the info button. You can see all the different information about that photo that you just took. Okay, well that really concludes this little short overview review of the Canon EOS 300D. I don't have any sample photos to take this time. I will be doing full reviews on certain cameras in the future. Let me know if you have any requests for those. But this is just a quick overview today, and I guess that's going to be about it. Let me give my final thoughts of this camera. I would say there are better options for the money. This camera has a bit of a collector's value, just due to being the first digital rebel, but it also does have some upsides for being that, which is the better build quality, like I said, the good ergonomics, and all that. But I would say that there definitely are cameras that are better than this one in the price range, which are going to be like the Canon 40D, Canon 30D, and certain ones of the prosumer, more prosumer cameras like that one. That being said, this camera is pretty competitive in the vintage camera market, and I would say that there are some real good pros. Like I mentioned before, the good ergonomics and the feel of shooting this camera, if that's what you're looking for. One thing I will mention is that this camera is a bit slow to operate. Being introduced right after the Canon 10D, this is about the oldest Canon has to offer, save for the D30 or the D60, which were a little bit older, and will be pretty slow as such. This was released in 2003. And just the startup times and everything else, waiting for photos to load, is going to be a little bit more time consuming than with newer cameras. Namely, like I said, the 20D, 30D, 40D, some of the prosumer cameras you can get for around the same price if you look out for deals. The reason I would buy this camera is if you can find one at a particularly good deal, or you already have one and just want to get into photography to start out with, this is definitely not a bad choice and will take great photos. Remember, the best camera is the one you have with you. Keep shooting photos. That Canon guy out. Goodbye.